observation. A little while back, President Thabo Mbeki raised a really important point. He observed the way in which the government was failing to deliver basic services and goods to the vast majority of South Africans. In short, a totally inefficient government was ensuring that the slack was being taken up by the private sector. And he actually suggested that this was a revolution which was unlikely to stop as a result of the failure of government to do the necessary. He then raised the point about if that is the case, would the private sector, as it were, extract greater profit from the provision of these services and goods, and therefore put the price of basic services and goods beyond the poor? It's a fundamental question that we need to ask as we go forward in South Africa. But before we actually discuss this with the panel, there is something which I'd like to show you in relation to the responses of political parties.
I don't hope that will be the future. The future should be that taxpayers should get the worth of that tax-paying money, because they pay tax to ensure that those services must be delivered. Now they still pay tax, but now they have no choice but to save themselves and their communities. Now they're getting involved in all these other activities like the infrastructure, fixing potholes and all that sort of things. And we say that is actually not fair towards the taxpayers and the people of South Africa.
The ideology of business is profit. Business has no other ideology. The ideology, business gets formed for profit. Don't listen to nonsense people tell you. Now you can't leave the whole population in the hands of people with one ideology, which is profit. We must not judge the inability of the ANC to run the state properly on our future.
Social transformation in itself is a complex undertaking. It can't be a job of government alone. What we are opposed to as the ANC is the mentality that seeks to suggest that we must do away, we must wither the state, wither government, and focus on the private sector, because me and you know very well that the private sector, its primal objective is a profit accumulation. It has nothing to do with providing services to the society that is required from government and the democratic state.
Without any question, I think the failure of government has been an increasing trend in South Africa. It is systematic and is taking place across the board, and more South Africans, even as individuals, are having to make up for the failures of government, whether it's in security, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education. And what we're seeing is a decline in every area of our government.
Where you've seen a failure of government to provide, something has to fill that vacuum. And I think many South Africans are not prepared to sit back and just allow this to happen, to just allow service delivery to collapse. They want to step in and fix things. But I keep saying to big business and to those people who are trying to step in where government's failed, the quickest way to resolve the issue is to vote a new government into power, because that will then be able to drive the reform agenda that is so important for us to be able to get the country off this terrible low growth, high debt, high unemployment trajectory onto a new one of prosperity, inclusiveness and growth for the country.
So let me start with you, Anne, invite all three of you, and then we'll get to everybody else. I mean, it could be argued the government's done a really good job about withering away the state.
I think that the government, maybe it's the only good job they've done. So the state is collapsing around us. And this is a terrible situation for a developing country like South Africa. And we shouldn't minimize it, because what we do need is an effective state, and we don't have one. So I think the poor suffer the most, and the economy is terrible. We currently have some 60% of the population living in poverty. And it's very hard to see how those people help themselves. So there are lots of ways. We're very loose about the private sector. So first point to make about the private sector is thank goodness for large companies who pay taxes, because that still helps South Africa to provide some services where we can, where the state is still able. But we're not getting value for money, and we have to do something about this. So this is not inevitable, and we could change the way South Africa is being governed.
But is it inevitable that unless we fix the state, the Mbeki observation, somebody takes up the slack, it will be the private sector? And would the second proposition hold too? Does it mean inevitably that goods and services will be put beyond the reach of the poor, because of the argument put up by at least one person there that business is in for a profit?
Look, the first question, what happens to when the state is hollowed out and is collapsing, is that you don't just get the private sector, that's the best of what you get. What you also get is criminal enterprises that exploit the poor even terribly. So chaos and anarchy is a terrible prospect for South Africa, number one. Number two, let's look at the positives about the private sector.
Please.
We still get food. Commercial agriculture and small-scale farmers are producing food, and supermarkets and all sorts of other private operators are getting this to the market. So there's some positives about what's happening today, where the private sector is one of the few things that's working. But there are worse things than the private sector. The truth is that society like this cannot survive without a state. And you get vigilantism, it's hard to see how the rule of law and democracy survives a hollowed out state. So I think there are people on the right who are fantasizing that you can do all sorts of things without the state. I think that is going to be extremely difficult. So I see a very bad future, and we need a more effective state. And I think there are a lot of positive things about the private sector. They don't just raise prices, they feed us.
Amos, do you accept that the state has let us down so enormously that actually it's so dysfunctional that poor people are the ones suffering the most?
Not really. Indeed, there are some failures from the state. And maybe when we start to talk about the question of the state, we must be holistic in terms of the state. So there are three arms of the state, and the other arms of the state are working properly.
Yes, but the judiciary doesn't basically deal with goods and services in that way. So we are talking about the legislature and the executive.
I'll come to the legislature. And
I'm happy for you to blame the judiciary, but I don't think they're the ones.
I think the state has got its failures, so it has not arrived at a total collapse. I think the state and business need each other to propel South Africa to a greater growth. So business has got its role. Remember, the state is the biggest spender, so business depends on the state for it to be able to prosper, and the state also has to depend on business on other areas. But then business cannot take over the state, because when it takes over the state, as it is bandied about, it means that services for the working class areas, for the working class in general and workers, are going to be not accessible. Something that Thabo Mbeki, even if when he raises these issues, he's quite careful to say if the state is going to reduce itself to a spectator in terms of providing services and goods and services to our people and give it to the private sector. The private sector is going to run amok. The private sector is only for profiting. So you can see, even when you're looking into those political parties that are talking, they are talking about the other strata of the of society, not necessarily looking into the working class, because most of the things that you want to take away from the state and take it to business, it will affect the working class and the poor.
But can I just say that's affecting them now? Because what's happening, the argument, even Becky's argument, and this is not mine, I'm putting you to his argument, is that as a result of the failure of the state, two things have happened. On the one hand, middle-class people, which may well include a lot of your members, I might add, when you look at the level of income, but let's leave that aside for the moment, otherwise we'll have a big argument about that. But I'm just assuming, for the purpose of debate, if you take that, they can actually use the private sector for all sorts of things, private education, private health, even putting up solar energy. The really poor can't do any of that. They haven't any money to do that. So the point about it is that they are dependent on the state. They can't even use the private sector. So they're the ones who are actually getting a short straw. Now, surely a so-called revolutionary organization like SARTA should be worried about that.
Well, we are worried about that, but then the fact of the matter is that we cannot wither away the state.
Not asking you, but do you accept the fact that my first proposition is, do you accept that the state has in fact put itself in the position where it isn't developing? I mean, Anne Bernstein seems to suggest, and I don't think you're disagreeing, the state's an important component in development, but this state's not doing its job. That's the argument.
Well, the state is able to do its job in a number of areas, and then is unable to do its job.
Could you give me one where it's successful?
I mean, in education, the state is successful in doing its job. Yes, it is successful.
Have you looked at the figures?
Yes, even if you look into the figures, but the state is trying.
Why are other African countries doing much better than us?
Well,
with far fewer
probably
resources.
maybe you
may
have to give me an opportunity to respond to you, because you jump into my mouth
okay, carry on.
Able to try and articulate some of the points that one is trying to articulate. I think we must not come here with a all gloomy picture of the capabilities of the state. We do understand that there are difficulties in some areas of the state, and then there are also prospects of success within the state. Where the state is withering, the state needs to be fixed in order for it to be able to look into the working class and the poor. There are areas where the state is able to work. The state has put RDP houses for the poor. The state has put free school for the poor. So the state has done so many things. It's just that there's some level of incapacity in some of the areas, which are the areas that we may have to look into in order for us to be able to assist the state to deliver its services. One is on the economy, that we work with the state in order for us to be able to build the economy. So we need change. What is change? Is a change in the changing in the economic policies of our country in order for them to be able to create growth in our country. What do we need to do? The state needs to work.
I'm going to come there. I promise you I'll give you a chance on that. What do you say, Mbusi?
So,
I mean, you've been fairly critical up till now. I'm not here, but I mean in other occasions.
So there is no denying that you need all the four social partners. Business is intervening a lot at the moment, and we're intervening because the center is not holding. We're intervening because of the very clear failure of government to provide some of the services that it needs to provide. We are intervening because the trading environment is at its worst at the moment. I mean, if you listen to the annual results that come from many businesses, Remgro was saying in our 85 years of operation, 2023 has been the worst trading environment that we've experienced. You know, APSA was saying this is the worst we've seen in 30 years. So there is that a message that is coming from businesses from all different industries. And I think where the biggest failure is, there is a failure in a whole lot of other industries. The biggest failure is in the network industries. You don't have network industries operating as they should, then you don't have an economy. You don't have investment. You don't have business. And it becomes important for business to intervene in as far as that is concerned, because remember, Cyril Ramaphosa stood at the State of the Nation address and said we need 2 trillion rands investment for the next 5 years to be able to develop our economy. Now, what exactly is the business case for bringing investment into South Africa when the 4 network industries, actually out of the 4, 3 are dysfunctional? Energy is dysfunctional, transport and logistics are dysfunctional, water is getting into a crisis point. The only one that works is telecoms, and maybe that's because someone had the sense, you know, of bringing in the private sector into telecom. That is why it's operating the way it's operating.
Could I put this
I don't
to you?
think...
Sorry to interrupt, but I almost made one point which I do want to put to you. And let me put it in a slightly different way. You can criticize me if I've got you wrong, but it's that if you go back to 94 and the history of apartheid, that it was a massive burden that any society was going to have to address the failures of 300 years of racist and sexist and homophobic rule, and that to some considerable extent the government did a whole range of things with regard to housing and education, etc., and that basically it's history that is the bigger burden, rather than that any government would have struggled under the situation. I think that's essentially what you're saying.
But
he's nodding, so I'm assuming I got it right. Yeah.
So I think when you look at where we are at the moment, we have also failed at the basic maintenance. That which we inherited in 1994, we have actually failed from an upkeep perspective. I think the West project that actually led to the decimation of a whole lot of state-owned entities and the state broadly is the state capture project. You know, it is the cadre deployment, you know, where you put public service employees who actually are loyal versus those that are capable. You know, the president himself has spoken about the professionalization of the public service. If we don't get the public service to operate in a professional manner, then you're actually going to have a whole lot of problems. So I really think that there is a function of maintenance. We can't blame everything on the state.
Okay, thank you. I've got a whole lot of hands up. You first, and I'll come to the 3 of you. Yes, please. Would you just introduce yourself before you start?
Yes, Mohamed Oswey from General Industries focusing on South Africa. I think the comrade of Kosatu have been disingenuous. The past 29 years of the ANC rule has been disastrous for the working class by every measure. Services are collapsing. The levels of unemployment, of poverty, poverty in terms of access to services, education, all of that have reached catastrophic level. There is no question about that. In addition to that, government is planning another onslaught. In August, the National Treasury issued a memo that says that government must stop hiring, right? In a situation wherein we have already 118,000 unfilled vacancies within public sectors, nurses, teachers, and so on, we mentioned them. They are going to stop a new infrastructure projects. That already is going to be a disaster in a situation wherein there's a massive backlog for housing and other key public infrastructures. Now, the idea, however, that government or rather corporate sector is a solution is also a hogwash, because let's look what is happening, right? In terms of corruption, which is the issue that people are using, right? There are two rankings internationally of this country. One is by Transparency International, that measures the corruption of the bureaucratic and the political elite. It ranks South Africa in number 72 in the world in terms of the worst levels of corruption. PwC measures a private sector corruption. It ranks South Africa number first with the most corrupt corporate sector in this country. And that's the reason that we have grey listing by the Global Finance Crime Watchdog that says that South Africa, corporate businesses are guilty of, money laundering.
I just want to understand something. Are you saying it's the private sector's fault that we had state capture?
I'm saying, of course, they did play.
So the state's got no responsibility for that?
The ANC is responsible because the role of the ANC.
Okay, I'm just trying to get an understanding.
Yes, the ANC, when it came to power in 1994 and accepted management of capitalism, it assumed the role of being political instrument of monopoly capital, but in a conditions where it also seek accumulation of the black capitalist class. It has to use tenders, outsourcing, privatization to facilitate corruption linked with tenders, and that is a source of corruption, but also of the kind of tender-related thing that we see.
Yes, I've got a whole lot. Yes, yes, you got the mic. So please carry on. I'll come to you too, Mark.
Terence Corrigan, Institute of Race Relations. It's a pleasure to be here because part of what President Mbeki was responding to was something our CEO had said.
Are you not taking credit for that?
A little bit. We went from South Africa went from a situation where the state had was playing a somewhat developmental role to now where it's playing a detrimental role and is moving very rapidly into what will be an emasculated role. Now, I'm glad you mentioned 1994 because I'm old enough to remember that, and I remember the passionate debates about what role should the state play. Do we want an interventionist state that will transform and whatever? Well, no one asked the question at that point, what could the state do? And the harsh reality is very little. Do you remember?
Do you still think that's the case?
Well, I think it's the case now. I think there were a number of.
No, I want to ask you: do you think that a libertarian model actually could possibly work in South Africa?
Well, I'm not sure who's advocating a libertarian model.
I'm just trying to establish what role you think the state should play then.
What role should it play? Ideally.
Yes. No, ideally, just in any way.
Well, look, if those network industries had been upgraded, I don't think there's anything inherently negative about a state-owned enterprise. What I'm talking about is the state-owned enterprises we have. The Transnets, the Escoms, whatever, the whole catalogue of disasters, the SAA that flies away with cash loads of contracts and delinquent directors and all the rest of it. I can say this right now that South Africa's middle class, your entrepreneurs, your professionals, let's say the hard sinews of those you need to run an economy, your technicians, your managers or whatever, many of them, and I know this from personal experience, and I'm sure you do too, are at a tipping point where it simply becomes too expensive to live in this country, and certainly you don't want, you question whether there's a future for your children. So as far as the private sector goes, I would like to see a state that could function and could regulate and could maintain law and order. We have a state that literally lost control of the physical boundaries of this country in 2021. Right. So let me just
finish, please, yeah.
Yes, just conclude here. We are sitting with a situation we're sitting at. This isn't an ideological question anymore. This is a question of, how do we keep society ticking over until something changes? Now, and on the question of the original state capture, the ANC's cadre deployment program, remember, that's 1997. That was declared by the Zondo Commission to be counter-constitutional and illegal. Our president has said, no way, we're carrying on with this. So I don't see the impulses to deal with that.
I've got a lot of people who want to speak, but I have to take a quick break. Yes, please.
Free Market Foundation. Firstly, there's nothing wrong with a profit motive. Profit seeking is something to be celebrated. It's how we create new value. If we want South Africa to develop, we need people to get wealthy, and you do that through profit seeking.
How much?
Well, within the boundaries of the law, and the state is there to maintain.
You do realise that levels of inequality are so egregious now around the world that people are extremely concerned about this. Serious economists are too.
Well, our biggest problem in South Africa is a lack of economic freedom and poverty. In the 2023 Economic Freedom of the World Index, South Africa ranked 94th out of 165 countries in the recent year. In 2000, it was ranked 47th. There is a direct correlation between prosperity and freedom. So we need to get that ranking back up, and that benefits the poor. The bottom 10% of the lowest quartile of that ranking, they earn $1,700 per capita. These are the poorest people in the bottom quartile. In the freest countries, they earn $14,000. So they earn 8 times more in free countries than they earn in poor countries. So prosperity benefits the poor the most.
Could I just ask you a simple question? Do you accept that the state has a significant role to play?
The state has a role to play in maintaining law and order, which it is not currently doing,
I'm not asking
and
about
upholding the rule of law.
Are you seriously
and it is failing on both of those
counts. Are you seriously telling me that you're a libertarian then?
Yes.
And tell me where, and give me one country in the world where that's worked.
Hong Kong was once a very prosperous place before the communists of China took it over.
Way. Where?
So, look, we need to talk about the state we have.
The problem, the old difficulty is that you've got no empirical evidence to show this.
Well, there's many countries, many free countries around the world enjoy vast prosperity.
Sorry, there's a difference between freedom. Canada, United States. A difference between freedom and, in a sense, having a state that actually has a role.
So we need to talk about the state that we have rather than the state we wish we had.
Okay, fair enough.
And in South Africa, the state is failing, and we need to think, well, what is going to provide the goods and services that are necessary for us to thrive in this country?
Okay.
That is the private sector. We also need to take a look at the political class in South Africa, which has implemented a socialist dogmatic ideology. Mr. Mbeki talks about... Beg your pardon? Mr. Mbeki talks about...
Now. What do you mean by a socialist ideology?
Well, it's something called the National Democratic Revolution, which Mr. Mbeki himself refers to.
Oddly enough, most socialists don't regard that. They regard that as stage one.
Okay, well, I am of the belief that you should take politicians at their word.
Seriously, they thought that was stage 2.
Okay.
We stuck at stage 1.
Well, Mr. Mbeki warns about the counter-revolution. I would say bring on the counter-revolution.
Okay, I got
because the revolution has actually destroyed a lot of the value in South Africa.
Next door, and then I'll come to you, Mark. If you introduce yourself, please. I promise you I'll come to you too. I'm going round. I promise I don't want to be gender discriminatory. Please carry on.
Hanki Matabane, I'm the CEO of the Black Business Council. I think it's important that we should not ignore the history. We should not only start in 1994, but firstly, the evidence that we have is that the state has not necessarily succeeded. When we look at the 7 million of people who are working, the majority of them, they pay tax on one side, but they still have to pay for private provision of services. But
that's the middle class.
Yeah, I think even the poor, they're trying that.
Well, yes, I suppose, yes.
Yeah, because the other...
But they can't simply afford
Yeah, they can't afford, but remember the black middle class also have to subsidize the poor because we have the other tax on top of the tax that we are paying. But we don't agree that the private sector must take over certain functions. There are things called public goods that must remain with the state.
I accept it.
We
So what
just need to find a way.
What is your proposal then, if I might ask you?
Our proposal is to make sure that there's nothing wrong with the cadre deployment as long as we do it right.
And how would you do it right?
Who deploys the cadres?
You have to deploy the right people. There are many capable people in South Africa who are available. We've seen it in other state-owned enterprises.
But I mean, who are these cadres you're going to appoint?
Those people need to be the ones who are given on opportunities rather than give. They are put on merit. I think I agree.
Legal processes.
Sorry, carry on. Sorry, he's being interrupted. Please carry on.
Yeah. So I was saying we need to make sure that we get the state to work by making sure that we put the capable people to positions, including political positions. We need to, if you look at the Minister of Electricity, for example, he's a capable person. Even when he talks, you can understand what he's talking about because he can comprehend what he's saying. So it's important that we need to identify more of him and put them into positions of responsibilities, and the economy will start working. But we can't put everything in the hands of the private sector, especially big business, because the market economy of South Africa is very, very concentrated on big business. Small business don't have even a place to play. So it's important that we need to open the space for small businesses, and then those are the businesses with a soul. They are not necessarily only profit motivated.
Yes, Mark. Can you just introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mark Barnes. I used to run the post office.
Well, then you're perfectly placed to tell us a few things.
First of all, there is no successful country that doesn't have a major state player in the economy.
Yeah.
The state is a fundamental participant in the economy, and talking about them as if we could exist without them is just nonsense. Okay. The question is, what are the different roles, and where should capital come from, and where should capital be applied? If you're looking for private sector capital which has choice, not only locally but internationally, I reckon the solution lies predominantly in foreign direct investment, then we have to offer an economic return to such capital, and that capital has to be directly invested in projects who are managed and operated by experts, until such time as a return is sufficient, and then those can become states of the country. So we need to have these parallel roles. You cannot possibly hope for the extent of transformation and developmental mandates that we have to have in this country unless we have a sound commercial foundation to fund that. So we have to have sound business, which has to pay tax, which has to fund the non-commercial mandates of society. Okay, we have to work together. We cannot work. It's not either the private sector or the state. It's who does what in producing a mix that can fund, non-commercial products and that can look after the social imperatives that we need to redress.
Thabo Mbeki's point, as I understood it, was that if you can't get the state right, he wasn't advocating privatization per se, I don't
either.
No, not the way I read it, but I might be wrong. But he wasn't. But what he was saying is, if you carry on this road, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it will happen, but the consequence of that will be even more dire than we have today.
Yes.
Because the private sector will end up serving 5 to 10% of the population.
And the rest will suffer.
The rest can't afford it, man. Okay. So what we don't need that. What we need is a definition of our different lanes and different purposes. You talked about making a reasonable profit. Let's define what that is. What's a reasonable return? And then let's extract the tax from that return and apply it to reasonable, otherwise non-commercial mandates and fund those.
Would you accept that for the purpose of the provision of basic goods and services, which could be quite, that there, you would want to say that the profit has to be controlled in some ways because you have to ensure that the vast majority of the population gets something out of this. They can't just be placed outside of their price. I mean, how you do that is another matter.
I think going to the point of price control starts messing with the fundamental drivers of the different lanes. So, you know, we're doing rather well at rugby, go Bokke, but it's because they pass the ball to the right person. There's this big tough guy, Ox, who's a prop, but he can't run fast. Okay, so he passes the ball to that skinny little oak in the wing, and he goes and scores the try. We've got to start passing the ball to each other. We've got to realise our strengths and weaknesses, and we've got to do this together. There's no us and them anymore, man. It's enough already. I'm sick of it.
Okay, very good. Yes, please. You've been very patient.
Yeah, no, very patient.
Could you introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Juliet Miabo. I'm the head of Executive Director for TEDCOSA, Township Economy Development Community of South Africa. I'm glad I'm speaking after him because it's just summarized it, because it's all about collaboration.
You should run the post office now.
Here we go.
Please carry on.
It's all about collaboration. It's all about, we have the concept of private-public partnership. So when that concept has always been linked with the private sector partnering with government, not looking at the fact that the public aspect, I'm representing township economies, township SMMEs, township business, what that also constitutes public. So meaning the private sector needs to play a role in developing the economy broadly, whether it's in the township, small entrepreneurs, without putting a ceiling to say the profit, because we know the private sector has to prioritize profit, without saying that, no, you can only have access to the crumbs while we get the big cake, because that's what profit is all about. And what we are seeing is we have very strange competition laws where there is a ceiling in terms of who can come in. The various sectors that are gate-kept by certain hierarchies and certain groupings that we cannot access. So the private-public partnership and collaboration has to be based on giving access to everyone. It's not, and when saying everyone, the people who are hardworking, who want to build this country. The private sector, my brother, has the responsibility to develop this country. You cannot leave that only as a responsibility of government, because when there's no development in this country, what that means is that the very people that who are getting poorer and poorer are going to come back and attack the very private sector and ban the malls, and we're going to say, oh, they're banning our malls. They're not banning their malls. Those are your malls. They don't get any value from it. So it has to be a real, true collaboration between private, public, and public should also include SMMEs and other players, not just government. And it is all our responsibility.
By the way,
I agree with you.
I should tell you that the purpose of the Competition Act is to do exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's supposed to democratize the economy. I'm not sure somebody's partly responsible, but I'm not sure we've succeeded. Well, 1 second, yes?
1 second.
I've got to give two other people. No, you've got to take that. I've got to place you on record.
Sorry, just 2 seconds. The informal economy that is one of our most vibrant, successful, growing economies, they borrow money at like 40 to 50% if you count properly, and they still make a profit. We should divert the capital into that at a proper cost, and we'd have a thriving economy. Don't just think of private sector as formal, established, old corporate South Africa. It isn't. There's a new definition of private sector. It's pervasive. It's beautiful. Go and sit in the middle of the main street of Alexander and watch it happen.
All right, you've had your 2 seconds. You've got a chance, and then I'm going to give it to the two of you. The two of you will come next. Sorry, but you carry on. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Bertus Bierman, CEO of Lebelela Water Users Association. I think we need to think a bit different here, and I like when you started talking about collaboration. Where we are operating, we're actually setting up a collaborative partnership between government and the private sector, where we intend to provide water to 390,000 people plus the industries on a basis that the entity that's doing it is a non-profit and it is funded by state and the private sector on a 50-50 basis. But it's also built on the principle that where lies your control? And your control is also 50-50.
I was going to ask you, who is it accountable to?
It is the minister is the Minister of Water and Sanitation, but the Water Users Association is then a entity that acts on behalf of its members. It has institutional members, 50%, and it has commercial users, 50%. And they together built this entity on the back of finance that's being provided to the institutional side as well as to the commercial side.
Yeah, please, would you put give me who you are, sorry.
Hi, I'm Julie Eccles. I'm from Workers' and Socialist Party, and I'm also a social justice activist. It's been a little bit surprising to hear some of the views, and I think especially the framing around the conversation, the assumption that value or that, jobs or that any of these things come from captains of industry or come from entrepreneurs or so on. Value comes from the working class. It's working class people who produce value, and that value is then exploited and extracted by the captains of industry. And when we're talking about development, when we're talking about privatization, we have always been captured. This has always been a country that is captured by these captains of industry, especially during apartheid years. So when we're talking about development, we really need to talk about the state's role in this.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yes.
But the question is, the state has failed.
Correct. And we have to look at why the state has failed, going all the way back to the negotiations of 1994.
Are you saying it was a pact, which was a compromise between the running dogs of capitalism and the ANC?
Correct. Ronnie Kasrils makes the same point. He was present during those negotiations. And I think we need to understand that privatization is the reason why the state has failed. When the comrade President of Giusa, Mamitwe Sebe, has made this point already, that it is the tender process. That process is the process whereby the money that is supposed to go to development is then distributed into the private sector. And if we had a state that was capacitated in order to fulfill its role as a state, then we wouldn't see that kind of privatization. For instance, one of the reasons ESCOM has failed so badly is because these private companies are doing built-in obsolescence. They're the ones who are, creating problems that they themselves would then be.
Which ones are we talking about? Are you talking about the level of corruption which has essentially bedeviled ESCOM? What precisely are you referring to?
I'm referring to, for instance, machinery that breaks, cable theft. We have to look into the syndicates that are making these things happen. Who are the syndicates who are stopping?
Well, the problem is that we have, somebody said rightly, that the level of corruption is such that we don't have the rule of law. So all sorts of renegade and awfully corrupt people actually are exploiting it at the expense of the poor.
So what is corruption? And it's actually very worrying because we're framing this conversation without proper definitions. So when we have collaboration between so-called the state and the private sector, there must be a partnership. It sounds lovely. But who is the state and the private sector? When we talk about the private sector, we're talking about the most powerful people in the country. We're talking about billionaires, people with so much power, and that they have so much power that they can buy politicians.
Just put something to you. I have to there are a whole lot of you who want to speak. I'm going to accommodate you all, I promise, but I have to take another break. They sort of have to get paid, apparently. Welcome back. I just want to turn to the panel for a moment before I come to all of you. You've heard quite a bit of this, Anne. I'm just interested in this idea that, well, Mark, of course, is suggesting, I suspect, that we shouldn't be looking at who's to blame because everybody's to blame. That doesn't help you. But there is a sense of disquiet that, given state capture, the private sector hasn't exactly done itself much credit. And therefore, we've got the balance all wrong one way or the other. And I'm just interested, you started this discussion by saying we need both sides of the equation. I'm just interested how you would foresee that happening in the light of many of the points that have been made.
Well, the most important point, which I think people want to avoid, some of them, is that the state is collapsing around us. So we can't then hope that the state is going to do all sorts of things unless we get a new government, of course. So I think that you have to define the private sector very broadly, which ranges from informal firms all the way to large multinationals. I'm in favor of all businesses and want them to expand as much as possible. And
but could I just put would I, listening to the two from small business,
yes,
there's a whole lot of economic literature that says that actually if you get small business right, the economy comes right.
Well, that literature's been questioned,
I know it has.
in America and elsewhere.
Yeah, but it's still there.
As my former chairman used to say, all businesses start small and hopefully they grow like babies to become adults.
Yeah.
And I'm in favor of that. One of the problems in South Africa is we attack the firms we have, generally the bigger firms, rather than focusing on how we get many more firms, which is what the country desperately needs. The problem is, I think everyone has to accept how deep the South African crisis is, because it's very hard to talk about what to do next unless we talk about politics. The problem at the moment is not only is the state collapsing, but there are predatory elites within the state that are stealing our money, which could be used to help small businesses, the infrastructure they need, and all sorts of things. So you have to first have the right diagnosis of why South Africa is in the trouble that it's in, and only then can you start to talk about how do we move forward. And that is appropriate roles for this kind of country, for government, the state, and for different kinds of private enterprise.
You see, that's exactly, well, there's just two observations. The one is, it's interesting, Amos made the point too, and I'd agree with it entirely, that clearly greater growth rates are absolutely essential. You're certainly not going to solve this problem, this country with a 0.5% or 1% growth rate. Now, we're going to get the medium-term budget later on, I think next week. I can take bets, right, that the Treasury will never have a prediction of 2, 3 or 4% growth over the next 5 years. I mean, I don't know, but I'm pretty confident that that's the case. Now, that's disastrous. So the question is, how the hell do we actually generate the levels of growth that actually then start helping the vast majority?
Well, one of the things we have to do is get out of a crisis response. It's the government wanders around and says, oh, something's gone wrong here, how unexpected. And then they come with a fix-it. And often business helps with the fix-it. What we need are competitive markets. Not throughout, I'm not saying through everything, but much more competitive markets so you get the benefits of much greater service delivery and lower prices. So competition is really important. We should talk a bit more about this. But I think I'm saying that it's very hard to think about South Africa's future on the current trajectory, which is downhill and is truly awful.
Okay.
And we won't get investment unless that turns.
Because when you talk about crisis of the thing, and they respond to crises, it seems to me my life bedeviled by that, because my football team, Manchester United, is in exactly the same situation. Amos, I wonder whether you could respond. A lot of people have been saying that we're underestimating, and as just said that, the crisis in the state. And I really would like a response on that.
No, maybe first and foremost, I must indicate that I'm not here to represent government. I'm representing workers.
That's fine.
One of the things that we may have to look at is that at least we're agreeing that there's a need of collaboration between business and government. I think we must not come to a point where we think that the state is no longer going to be a player. It doesn't exist.
Got you.
And I think it is disheartening to hear people sitting here saying that we just want to be billionaire and pay the working class peasant money that is coming from. I think free market does not have a space in our country. How do you want to be the richest of them all? And at the end of the day, then you say, for you to be rich, you are just going to make the working class to be rich. I think that's nonsense. I think the reality of the matter is that all of us must come to the party and fix what is a problem in the state. We agree that there are myriads of problems where we need interventions. I think those interventions are not going to be resolved without us working together. I think that's the first point that we
Are you suggesting
to
something like which everybody mutters about, an economic cadetha? We actually sat down and actually got an agreement of that kind.
I mean, yes. I mean, you needed to go. Remember, we've got different policy positions that we are having. We are anti-privatization, so we can't give everything to the hands of the private sector. We can't do that. All of us must come to the party. Let us not throw stone now. We are sitting in a crisis. We are sitting in the ticking time bomb, and when we are sitting in a ticking time bomb, what is it that we do in order for us to assist? Because we need the state, all of us. We need business, all of us, in order for us to prosper and go forward. So we need to go back and say our policy position. What do we do about Transnet? And then we have to give inputs in terms of how to resolve our problems at Transnet. We as COSATU went to Netleg and put a social compact for ESCOM. And I think the Minister of Electricity is implementing part of COSATU's suggestion in order for us to get out of the crisis that we find ourselves to be in. Maybe just before you interject.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, the second issue is we as COSATU, particularly in this province, we saw it fit that, in fact, what we need to, it's an engagement with our society and go to what we call a socio-economic conference wherein we are going to get small businesses. How do we work together with them? Because we believe that there's a bigger economy, local economy which we can exploit in order for it to be able to benefit the working class and the poor. Most of the people here are not necessarily talking about the working class and the poor. They talk about themselves. They talk about how business, can prosper in the circumstances that we find ourselves to be in. And we think that that is a crisis. So we are not for government. We are not for government failures. But then we are saying the government failures can be resolved by all of us, and let us work together. I mean, somebody said we must change government. Yes, we are going to the elections. So you have your choice to change a government. We are going to the election anyway. So let's go to the election. Those who want change have to change. So that's what we need to do.
I mean, from your perspective, I mean, you guys, business has tried, I think, in transport and electricity, etc., to make a contribution. And when I interviewed your colleague Cass Cavadi in another context, he was very careful to say, in answer to some of these points, we're not looking to take over these things, but we're trying to help. So you have to envisage that at some point the ship rights itself. How is that going to happen?
That's a very good question. I'm really not sure, but I think you are quite right.
Probably the most honest thing I've heard.
I'm really not sure what the private sector is doing at the moment in terms of the government-business collaboration that you have that is focusing on the three areas. It's really a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It is unsustainable. We cannot continue pouring so much money into ESCOM and Transnet to fix it because government is failing to do its job. So I think we realize that Rome is burning and business cannot stand by and watch Rome burning because we too are impacted. So I really think that we're going to have to get to that point where we get government to do what it needs to do, But I think in doing that, we cannot, some of the views that are actually coming out here are quite problematic. You cannot excuse the incompetence and the failure of government. Someone needs to be the adult in the room. Government needs to do what it needs to do. If you're complaining, and I absolutely agree, from a corruption perspective, the private sector too is involved. You're sitting in a country that has got serious issues in as far as issues of ethics and whatever the cases is concerned. And it is naive to think that the private sector is not a microcosm of this society, because we too obviously would be tainted by the huge systemic endemic corruption that you actually have.
Because corruption works both ways, private and public.
There is a corruptor and a corruptee.
Some of the points being made here are precisely about that.
There is a corruptor and a corruptee, so I don't think that you can actually sit and excuse government and saying it is the private sector's fault, because who's the adult in the room, and who has let the dogs in, and the dogs have been let in by government.
Thank you very much. Yes. Yes. Introduce yourself too, please.
I'm Daily Keswa. I'm a business analyst. My view on this is that who is the state? The state is made of people. And the same people are the ones that are stealing from the society. We cannot have a functioning state as long as we don't have anti-corruption instruments in place. And we've seen how the leaders of these big SOEs have not been held accountable for the crimes that they've committed towards the society. And for me, before we even get to the hybrid model of privatization, we need to clean up the state. And we need to clean it up from the system down to the men on the ground. Because corruption is like a cancer. It has spread throughout, from top management down to the person who is a non-management employee.
Is that the National Prosecuting Authority who's to blame then?
Correct. We have
You say correct?
Yes, we have to have legal measures in place that hold these leaders accountable. And until we start cleaning it up, we are still going to go around in circles, because even if we introduce the hybrid model of privatization, we are still going to have the problems, because the problem is the people. So we need to hire leaders and put leaders in place who do not want to eat first. Because it creates...
Can you tell me who they are?
it creates a ripple effect in our communities, unemployment, and it's not getting better. Our GDP is actually...
That's exactly the point I made earlier.
Exactly,
yes,
exactly my point.
I take the point.
So it's not getting better, but it's not getting better because of our leaders.
Yes. I'm going to give you a chance, but you've spoken before, so yes, please, you want to say something, and then I'm going to come down. I think you... no, wait a minute. Yeah. He has not spoken, and either of you, and then I'll come to the rest of you. No, you'll all get your chance, but carry on.
No, thanks. My name is Tlorhi Museki, the National Chairperson of the Transformation Alliance. I'm listening to everybody in the room
Sorry,
here.
what is the Transformation Alliance? Excuse my ignorance.
It's a political party that would have emanated from the erstwhile
apartheid. Okay, all right. Yeah, sorry.
I'm saying I'm listening to everybody in the room here, and I realize that our problems are still too many. We sitting here with people who you can clearly tell that there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and you've got the working class that is also equally advocating for issues that has got nothing to do with the poor. I think we've got a long way to go. Our suggestion has always been that there are people who are suggesting that our 2024 has to be our 1994. We need a CODESA as South Africa. CODESA that wouldn't have been the one that we have seen previously.
You're agreeing with Amos, effectively. We should sit down together.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Because South Africa is not where we would have anticipated. And as a result, we are calling on that CODESA to take place before we even go to elections.
Can I just make one point to you? We could have as many CODESAs as we like, but there has to be political will. Because you can have a wonderful conversation. We can all agree here. I mean, miraculously not going to happen, but assuming we all did, it doesn't make a damn difference, because unless there's the political will to implement the decisions, nothing ever happens.
There is a political will.
You think so?
Yes, indeed. That's why we are saying, I mean, look at Gauteng, for instance. After 2021 elections, there has been a significant change in what would have been the leader of government. Even though ANC have stole back this government, we are going to have a situation where we bring in the new broom of leaders who will see to it that South Africa gets to where it's supposed to be. Doesn't seem to be a new broom at the moment, the way when I drive around. Come again?
There doesn't seem to be a new broom anywhere.
No, there is a new broom.
Desperate need for a new broom.
Yeah, hence why I'm saying there is a new broom. We just need to get to the new CODESA and install leaders with a political will to change South Africa to be where it's supposed to be rather than where it is right now.
Thank you. Yes, please. And then I'll come to you, Leon, and I'll come to... Yes, please.
I'm PJ Mguni from the South African Communist Party National. Quite a number of issues have transpired in the debate. I just want to start with the notion of a revolution and say to fellow South Africans that there is no way we would have been where we are had there been no revolution. In fact, coming from exile, Joe Slovo says at length here, after the talks about talks, that we call on our white compatriots not to be blinded by swimming pools and campaigns and to face the reality. The current jargon would be, wake up and smell the coffee. It's not only the white question. It's about anyone who do not realize that we have a revolution. And hence, I want to go to the former President Thabo Mbeki's point. I agree and disagree. I agree with him in raising the amber flicker lights, that what we have may take us to counter-revolution, a decay of the state, a hollowing of the state, and all that. But I disagree with him insofar as he forgets that us in the South African Communist Party, way back in the 90s, we complained about a number of phenomena about the lean role of the state, the right sizing, and all that, which has led us to where we are. My last point for now is about capitalism and how colleagues in the discussion are looking at it and deliberately throwing a blind eye. Yes, parasitic capitalism, the Guptas and all of those who are milking the state and hollowing the state, is as damned as, on the other hand, monopoly capitalism, the one that has no respect for the red-lined people in the rural areas, in the townships, because she is absolutely correct. Production comes from human labor, and Kosatu, given a time, would definitely say that. However, why is it that everyone is born free, but at some point, some are more richer than others, and therefore others has got to be the toiling people for the rest? I leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Can I just ask you one thing? Yeah. You speak very eloquently about the fact that you warned in the 1990s where it was going. You could have stood all on your own as the South African Communist Party and offered South African alternative, but you never did that. So don't you think that's a bit of a irony?
It is ironic. Oh, because Oliver Tambo sums it up. He says ours is an alliance sealed in blood. Because in summing out the South African society, which most people I can read in the meeting,
as opposed to an alliance of convenience.
No, in the sense that race, class, and gender, where the issues were confronted with, and therefore you wouldn't, at the instance of the right sizing, the restructuring, the 1996 class project, at that stage then break free at that point. You still had to pursue it within the alliance with the organized labor and everyone else, and the poor people in the townships and elsewhere.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes, Leon, and then I'm coming. Yeah.
Yes,
sorry, you have to introduce yourself.
Leon Lowe and the Freedom Foundation.
Yes.
There are lots of confusing things there. One is the term the private sector, and a few people have made the point, Rumbi and others, and one or two, Mike, that it's got to be understood that it's everything other than the state. The vast majority of people in the private sector are the poor, the informal traders, the small businesses, the peasant farmers. This is the private sector. The JSE, which is nearby us, is actually a small proportion of it. Surprisingly small proportion. That's the first thing. Secondly,
the question is who influences government policy.
Yes.
Leon.
Okay.
And may I say this to you? The argument has been that throughout apartheid, it was mining capital, etc., who dictated the trajectory of the state. It's not surprising, therefore, people are deeply suspicious.
Yes. The point is that as we sit here now, black South Africans, and I hate playing the race card, but let's be clear about it, the majority of your members are black people, Rumbi's members.
Yes, but the argument being that it's an elite, not representative of the vast majority.
No, these are to this day the victims. They are being cleared off the streets ruthlessly with dogs and police and horses. This is the peasant farmers are not allowed to sell their produce. The people living in small villages and towns may not own their land. They may not trade. Every single backyard operation in Alex is criminalized by the zoning laws. That's the first thing. The second thing is the poor. A lot of talk about the poor, loose talk. Let's understand this clearly. The poor everywhere and always migrate in one direction and one direction only, from where the markets are less free to where the markets are more free, and from where there are fewer billionaires to where there are more billionaires. They know something the intellectuals don't.
Which is what?
The best place to be poor is where there is most wealth. Where there is most wealth is where the economies are freer. That is not debatable. It is just empirically true.
Well, when I drive around some of the wealthier areas of this town and my town in Cape Town, I see unbelievably desperate people in wealthy areas.
Yes, but let's understand something clearly. There are indices, various ones, World Economic Freedom Index and the Competitive Index. They all show the same thing. The freest economies not only are the wealthiest, but have the wealthiest poor people. And they are the ones to which the poor go. And the poor are sensible to do that. They don't care darn about billionaires. They just want to be where it's better for them. And that is in where they now, now on Becky's point. Very important.
Yes, but I have to take a break, so just make your point.
Okay, and Becky's concerned about the takeover by the private sector of the state. He should be thrilled that it's filling the breach left by bad government.
No, he's not thrilled, because his argument is that if they take it over, middle-class people will get their goods and services, and the vast majority of the poor people will it will be placed out of their reach.
No.
I can put up a solar and have electricity, but if I'm living in Alex or in the rural areas, I'm in the dark all the time. And how do I accommodate those students I teach who come from those areas and have to study at night with no lights?
It's quite simple. What you do is you stop oppressing them. That is what is being
really?
done now.
And then all of a sudden it will work.
The poor people living in Marathon and Delport, one of the biggest and poorest squatter settlements in South Africa, where I work, they are forbidden from improving their quality of housing. If they replace their tin shack with a brick, the council comes and bulldozes it down. So you start off by saying, liberate the poor. And the poor want liberation, and they know liberation. Rumbi up there represents the poor people who, the Joburg City Council chased 8,000 street traders off the streets brutally. I know one of them, Maria, who lost her finger. Now,
you're way out of time, Leon. Don't make your point.
There was a constitutional judgment, which you should know about, where the Constitution, for the first time ever, I believe, had a summary hearing, universal decision, the council had to let the people back onto the streets. Who brought that about? Well, it was people like Rumbi.
I got the point, Leon. Okay, sorry, a lot of people on the queue. I have to take a break, and then I'll